So, some of you may have noticed the other week that I scheduled 2 videos in quick succession. And the reason? Well, I took a little trip. Cavalrio in the Algarve is a perfect retreat if you want to chill out and relax. And to be honest, I didn't realise how much I needed it. But I'm not much for sitting down, and after a couple of days sitting by the poolside, I was eager to explore. Follow Me tours are a great and affordable way to explore the Algarve without the stress of driving. The tours are carefully planned and the guide caters to most people, even offering multilingual tours. I was on my way on one of these tours when we crossed some railway lines. Now, this was the first sign of railways since I arrived, and naturally I was curious. But the lines looked strange. They looked wider than what I was used to back home, and a quick internet search proved me right. They were. Throughout the centuries, and being the most westerly point of continental Europe, Portugal's shipping fleet was a force to be reckoned with. It was a major freight hub, and many explorers would set off from there, ready to find the new world. But you could only describe the governance of the country as complicated. Its instability prevented any further transportation progress. But in the 1840s, the minister Costa Cabral was able to make a breakthrough in the introduction of a unified governance. It was enough that he managed to introduce the first inkling of a railway plan. It wasn't successful, but it did give rise to the need of a railway that would not only service the country, but connect it with wider Europe and to the ports. Costa Cabral would be thrown out of power by the 1850s, but the idea stuck. With other countries getting better connections by the month, the need for a railway was getting greater and greater. At the same time, the port of Lisbon was growing, both being with the capital city and the only capital in Europe to connect to the Atlantic directly. Its large port was perfect to bring in the growing freight from the Americas. It was logical that it must receive the first railway. Even though politics-wise things were still unsettled, all parties did agree with the plan. The plan was a 23-mile-long track to the town of Carregado. It was a small start, but the inland town offered expansion to other towns and eventually reaching the border and its ally, Spain. At first, the railway used a unique gauge. However, this wouldn't be suitable if it wanted to work with other railways, so it turned to Spain for advice. Now, because of Spain's terrain and its structure, the standard established gauge that the rest of Europe was adopting wasn't working. It was decided that rather than using one unified gauge and putting up with the problems of tight corners and derailments, they would adapt the gauge for the terrain. As such, Spain has no less than 7 different gauges, but the most common was Iberian gauge. Named after the Iberian Peninsula, the gauge is the second most popular broad gauge track. At 5 foot 6 inches, it's only a few millimetres shy of its Indian counterpart. The broad gauge allows the trains to have better stability, but its largest advantage was when it came to tight curves in the mountains and rocky regions. There was no getting away from it, the terrain forced the curves, but the wider gauge helped keep the trains on the tracks. Like Spain, Portugal used several different gauges dependent on what the area required, but mainly used Iberian and narrow gauge. The line was completed by the end of the 1860s and there was a brief break in the building, but new track was laid at a pace in the 1870s. The majority of the framework, including most of the Algarve region, was done, controlled mainly by private companies. The focus was on the poorest areas. By offering them a chance to move their goods and produce to a wider audience, it was hoped to regenerate those areas and help them out of poverty. It worked a treat, enabling those areas to become rich in exporting olives, oranges, cork and strawberries, among other goods. At the turn of the century, the basic railway was firmly established, with the majority, like many railways, of the line owned by private companies. Although the terrain was a problem initially, the mountains helped protect the majority of the country from being impacted by the First World War. It was also helped that air warfare was in its infancy. Like many other countries, Portugal would benefit from the technological advancements the war provided, and there was a surge in the use of the motorcar and the lorry. The railway companies struggled to compete, and unfortunately routes were forced to close. When the Second World War approached in 1939, Portugal decided to remain neutral. This declaration meant that the country avoided the German advances, and the country was left mostly alone. Progress on the road upgrades continued at the cost to the railways. The government refused to reinvest anything, and the separate companies found it was almost impossible to make any form of profit, and the immediate post-war slump hit the country hard. The railway companies had no choice. They had to act and approach the government with a view to nationalising the railway. The government formally agreed, citing that no railway would be a detriment, and agreed now that it was under its control, investment would soon follow. Over the next 30 years, the railway would see improvement, including experimenting with electric power and better track layout, allowing faster and more efficient trains. Although on the front, the railway was under unified control, but from 1933 the country was being ruled under the Estado Novo dictatorship. In 1974, the Carnation Revolution overthrew the regime, and for the first time the country was under democratic rule. After the fall, the railway was reinvested and received a boost when Portugal joined the EEC. The extra investment meant faster speeds and even some closure reversals. As the lines were modernised, it sparked growth and freight movements. The territory also started to spark another trade, tourism. Now that the country was settling into a democratic life, tourists were starting to arrive to savour the stunning beaches, the fantastic weather, and enjoy a much more relaxed way of life. Railways started to connect to France and beyond, and further to the south to the Algarve. Soon, high-speed trains reaching over 220 kilometres an hour will be introduced. But the work hasn't stopped. Even as we speak, the government is undergoing a programme of regeneration. High-speed railways linking the country's main towns and regions is the goal. With improved rails, the gauge will be changed to standard gauge to comply with international trains. I only spent a week in the Algarve, and although I'm not the best flyer, I am itching to go back. There's lots of places I have not explored yet, but when I head back, the majority of the lines will be done, and one day I'll head north to Lisbon Train Museum, see what delights they've got there.